Welcome, everybody. I think some people, let's see, we're having some, we'll be starting right at like 12:03. And you guys can all see my screen, right?
Yes.
You can, yes.
Well, you are joining us. Why don't you use your chat to say where you seeing us from and what organization or agency are you a part of for today?
Elsa, did you say the check-in question is, or self-introduction question is which organization or agency folks are from?
Yes. Thank you. Let's use the chat right here. I'm going to put it here. Just 2 minutes. We will start in just, there it is. We have people from the city of Seattle, the Human Services Department, Youth and Family Empowerment Division, Planning Unit. Welcome. Have folks from the Seattle Office of Sustainability and the Environment. Welcome, Tricia. We are going to be starting in 1 minute. You want to use the chat just to practice your chat muscle. Is that a thing? Thank you for those who have their cameras, and I think you're all muted. But if at any point you have questions or comments, please use your chat. I'm going to start at 12:03. Oh, I don't know. 1 minute. Well, I think we're going to be starting now. Welcome everybody to our monthly series. This is the I Love Census Data Creative Conversation series about the data in Seattle. And we are very excited to have you today with us. We've been having lots of conversations throughout the year, and today we are talking about youth and how data helps youth succeed. And by that, we are going to be learning from many different agencies. We have a packed and wonderful group of people who are going to talk to us about how does data help youth succeed in Seattle. We have been having this conversations this year after a very intense 2020 census outreach work, and then knowing that so many people wanted to know what happens with the data that not only census but other places collect and how can we use it. And so I encourage everyone, if you have thoughts and ideas of what would you want to learn or hear, send it our way. And we are planning for 2022. The series brings together community members, city agencies and staff, data professionals, community artists sometimes for interactive presentations. Today, you will be learning about Seattle data, youth demographics, mental and behavioral health, federal college preparation grants, and impacts on COVID-19 or SPS enrollment trends. This is going to be our agenda for today. We're hoping to end right by 1:30, and we have lots of questions. I want to be moving on to introducing our wonderful speakers today. My name is Elsa Batres Boni. I am a Civic Engagement Advisor for the Department of Neighborhoods, and we have a great group. I also want to make sure that we acknowledge our colleague Shushan from the Office of Civil Rights, who is part of this collaboration between the city demographer, Diana Canzoneri, from OPCV, Shushan from the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Neighborhoods. And so with that, I want to start all of us before I introduce our guests with a land acknowledgement, and to make sure that we recognize that we are on Indigenous land, the traditional and current territories of the Duwamish people. And with that, I'd love to introduce you to our city demographer. Diana Canzoneri has been in the city's demographer for 12 years. She works in the Office of Planning and Community Development and provides analysis to inform neighborhood planning, long-range planning for growth, management, and the development of housing policy. She also provides information on population characteristics and community conditions to officials, colleagues throughout the city, and organizations with a particular emphasis on racial justice. Thank you for being here. We are also very excited to invite our friends from the Department of Early Learning. And we have Holly Campbell, who is the interim manager for the Performance and Evaluation Unit of the City of Seattle's Department of Education and Early Learning. She focuses on turning administrative and evaluation data into actionable insights through data visualization. So I'm very excited to hear from Holly today. Her work has focused on family, children, and youth from prenatal services to college graduation. We're very happy to have Holly here. Her colleague, Isabel Callaway, is a senior data advisor at the City of Seattle's Department of the Early Education. And she worked at the Puget Sound Educational Service District, where she provided research and evaluation support of a variety of local projects, including King County's Best Starts for Kids initiative. We're going to be talking a lot about all these programs that we love for our kids and youth in Seattle. So welcome, and thank you, Isabel, for being here. We will also be hearing from Hannah Parveen. She's the Healthy Schools Coordinator in the Prevention and Intervention Department at the Seattle Public Schools. She started working with the district over 4 years ago after graduating with a master's in public health from the University of Washington. Her work is funded through the Best Starts for Kids levy and focuses on enhancing student learning and well-being through the delivery of comprehensive prevention programming, with an emphasis on reducing substance use and other risky behaviors. We will be learning lots of data from particular survey and data that SPS and we have in the city. Finally, but not least, we have Janine Needles, who is a demographer on the enrollment planning team with Seattle Public Schools. I learned through this series that public schools have a series of demographers as well. And this is an exciting time to get to hear what are those trends. Janine began working with the district just over a year ago. So welcome to this. We're so excited to be able to have a contact there so we can get some numbers and lots of new things and development information. Her work with Seattle Public Schools is centered around supporting the equity center initiatives of district departments through research and data analysis, building partnerships with affordable housing providers, assisting with data sharing agreements, and informing decision-making through compiling, cleaning, and analyzing large sets of demographic data. One of the things I am so excited to have this sessions is that we get to hear from our demographers, people who are into data, and try to make it as comprehensible for all of us who are not dealing with data constantly. So for that, I'm going to give it out to, we're going to have a chance to have presenters and then ask questions in the chat, make comments. We'll be able to try to track them and answer them in the chat. And if not, at the end of each presentation, we'll have a little time to answer questions. So with that, I'll leave you with Diana Canzoneri, who's going to talk to us about Seattle demographics of youth in Seattle. So welcome, Diana. Did I skip a?
You're good. Thanks a bunch. Okay. We can start with a slide because we have a lot of information to share with you. So here we have a pair of pie charts with some really basic information on age and racial composition in Seattle. So what I'm going to be doing is using decennial census data to show you trends and patterns in the child population, that is the population under 18. I'm going to do some comparisons with the adult population. I'm going to do some geographic comparisons and look at some neighborhood patterns as well. So back to these two charts. So we've got some basic information in these pie charts on age and racial composition in the city. The pie chart with the 2010 census numbers is on the left, while the chart with the new 2020 census data is on the right. So these two charts are showing the people of color share of our population, shown in the blue segments, in comparison with the white share, shown in the gray segments. So these segments are further divided into kids, and a dark blue slice in each pie represents children of color. And one thing in particular that I want to point out here is that as of 2020, children of color began to make up just over half of the child population in Seattle. Next slide, please. This slide shows us data from the last 4 decennial censuses to give us some insights into trends in Seattle's demographics compared to trends in the rest of King County. As shown in the chart on the upper left, the people of color share of the population in Seattle grew with each census, but this growth has been a lot more dramatic in the rest of King County. So now let's look at the chart on the upper right. We can see that children of color increased very rapidly as a share of the child population in the rest of King County. So that stair-stepping chart all the way over to the right, super dramatic growth. The long-term trend within Seattle itself is also one of increase, but look at the variation in the last 4 decennial censuses. It's really stunning how much more gradual and sort of in fits and starts that pattern is compared to the rest of King County. The bottom chart is looking at the overall child population share of the population, and both in Seattle and in King County, and the remainder of King County, the child share of the population has been declining gradually over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're switching back to looking just at Seattle, and we're looking at growth rates by race for the child population in the first column of numbers and the adult population in the second column. And on this slide, we're looking at growth rates just in the last decade. You can see that the child population in Seattle grew by about 14% between 2010 and 2020, while the adult population grew at a faster pace. Broadly speaking, for both children and adults, growth was faster among people of color than among whites. This was especially actually the case for adults. There was, however, as you see, a lot of variation among different groups of color. Increases in the multiracial population and the Latinx population were the biggest drivers of both child and adult population growth. But zero in on what happened with the Asian population It's really interesting. The 2020 census suggests that the number of Asian children in Seattle actually declined since 2010, even though the increase in Asian adults was a substantial contributor to Seattle's population growth. Okay, next slide. So here I'm going to show you some maps of Seattle. And these maps look at neighborhood growth rates for different segments of the population. In this slide, for the child population on the left and the adult population on the right, one thing to note here is the really striking decrease in the child population that happened in much of South Seattle. Next slide. Here, we're comparing population growth rates for children of color on the left to growth rates for white children on the right. The contrasting patterns that we see here are even more stark. Here we see that the number of children decreased in a large swath. The number of children of color actually decreased in a large swath of neighborhoods that includes much of the central area in South Seattle. Next slide. And a final pair of maps. Here we're comparing population growth rates for children of color to growth rates for adults of color. And it's really interesting that trends were quite different for children of color compared with adults of color in the central area and in parts of South Seattle. Actually, for adults of color, their numbers only decreased in South Park in contrast to what happened with children of color. So I know this is kind of a lot to unpack in your minds. We will have a copy of the slideshow available, and that will be sent out from the Department of Neighborhoods within, imagine, a couple of days. Now I would like to pass it over to Holly Campbell from Deal.
Hey, friends. I really appreciated that presentation, Diana. It's a great look at what's been going on, big picture. But I know everybody on the call wants to know, but how can I use this to get money from the feds? Because that's a central value I think we all share. So I'm going to talk to you today about how Deal uses census data to prepare for a federal grant. Next slide, please. So Deal has a program that we administer called Upward Bound. It's a federally funded college readiness program focused on preparing low-income and first-generation college students for higher education by promoting academic achievement, goal setting, and career exploration. I am not an expert on this program. I would like to acknowledge that we have Karen Akata and Amelia Moore on the call today. So if you have any questions about Upward Bound, you can pop them into the chat and they might be able to answer you. The city of Seattle runs the Upward Bound program at Garfield and Rainier Beach High Schools. UW has a program over at Chief South, Cleveland, and Franklin. But for our purposes today, the most important thing you need to know is that we have to reapply for another 5 years of funding in 2022. Next slide, please. So in order to make sure that we continue to get funding, we have to show need for the project. It's almost a quarter of the score of our proposal that goes to the federal government. They want to know about community poverty rates, community educational achievement, dropout rates, attendance rates, counselor ratios, test scores, all sorts of things like that. I do want to acknowledge that it's extremely deficit-based. And as we prepare our application, I know that our program staff are hard on work at making sure that we are presenting these facts in as strength-based way as possible and making sure that we're honoring our families. But we need to be able to explain to the federal government why Seattle needs this money in order to help first generation and low income high school students. Next slide. Unfortunately, for purposes of this grant, we are one of the wealthiest, most well-educated cities in the United States. So any reviewer of our federal grant is going to be taking one look saying, Seattle, I know them, they're Amazon money. So we have to be able to articulate who can still benefit and how many people are we talking about. We're going to have to find a narrative that will tell the story of these first generation and low income students in a way that will both appeal to their deficit-based lens while also being respectful. Next slide, please. So there is a organization called the Office of the Superintendent for Public Instruction, or OSPI, that collects all the information on the schools and has them freely available there at WashingtonStateReportCard.ospi. You've got the address. And that's where you can get some very basic facts about the school. We can see their racial breakdown. We can see what percentage are low income. Next slide, please. So we know the racial makeup and the low income, which, for your information, it means free and reduced lunch program, which is 185% federal poverty line or both, but we don't really get any kind of sub breakdowns like low income by race, and there's certainly nothing about their parents' educational status. Next slide. And so we can use the American Community Survey to fill in the gaps. For those of you who were at the Heart Census data series last month, I believe that Diana explained a little bit about what the American Community Survey is. It is an annual sample survey instead of everybody like the decennial census, but it also asks really detailed questions about income and education and work status, all sorts of very useful things. And they do it every 5 years, but we like to use the 5-year estimates, which kind of average the results of the last 5 years. It doesn't feel as up to date maybe, but because we are looking at small little snippets of the population when we disaggregate and we look at, all right, we're going to look at this population in this zip code, it really helps to make sure you get that bigger sample size so that the numbers are a little bit more stable. Now, as I go through this presentation, we do acknowledge that not all students live in the school zip codes and that there's a lot of people in the community without high school age children, but we're helping to set the community context. And a lot of what at least I do with data is figure out what data do we have available and what can get us close enough, a good enough estimate in order to make our argument or do our planning that we need to do to deliver excellent programs. Next slide. So what you would do is you would just go on down to data.census.gov and pop in the words ZCTA5 and then the zip code you're interested in and then the topic. So I have poverty by race, and then it'll get you a bunch of tables. But it's very important to put in that ZCTA5 because what they're actually tracking isn't exactly zip code, but it's like a cross between the administrative boundaries that the census uses, which are called census tracts, and the administrative boundaries that the post office has that are zip codes. And it's close enough for our purposes. It's kind of a longer discussion, but something happened with their search algorithm a couple of weeks ago where you have to put in the ZIC-to-5 for this to work. It made Isabel and me almost have a heart attack, but then we've discovered if you put in ZIC-to-5, it actually ends up working. So Isabel, once we figured that out, what happens next?
So what happens next is we're going to walk you through 2 sort of concrete examples of how we use census data. So this first example is how do we determine first generation college status? So that isn't like regularly available data at OSPI level. So we're going to use the census to make some best guesses. So step 1, we're going to decide what area we're looking at. For this example, we decided to look at Garfield High School, and they are in the zip code 98122. So we typed in zip-to-5 98122 into this data census. Then we're thinking about what question are we trying to ask? Well, if we're interested in thinking about how many students might be the first in their family to go to college, we want to think about educational attainment levels. So type in educational attainment. And then specifically, we're interested in looking at the data by age because we want to think about parent or guardian age approximately. So put all that in, see the tables that come up, and we're going to go ahead and click on that first table, educational attainment. That's from the American Community Survey. Click next. So you might get a table that looks something like this. You can see on the left-hand side, there's different kind of population age ranges that we might be interested in looking in. And then each column shows about the total, so the number of folks in that population in the zip code, and then the percent estimate. And these are all estimates. Holly will go into a bit more about that of margin of error in our next example. So Elsa, if you could click next. We were interested in 35 to 64-year-olds because we're going to make our best guess and say that is about the age of a potential parent or guardian of a Garfield High School student. And as you can see, it's broken down by, how many of 35 to 44-year-olds have a high school graduation or high school degree or higher, how many have a bachelor's degree or higher. And you can see that, yeah, it already exists. So you can see 65% of 35 to 44-year-olds in the Garfield zip code have a bachelor's degree or higher, and 58% of 45 to 64-year-olds have one. But we want to know that whole population together, so we're going to do a bit of our own math. You can click next. So to combine these populations, we are going to add up the total of both groups who have a bachelor's degree or higher, divide it by the total number of those people living in the zip code, and get our number of 61%. Go next slide. What we're going to do is replicate this step for the Rainier Beach High School area and their zip code. We also want to look at it across Seattle so we can compare this data to emphasize why we want to be in these two schools, why the need is there. And you can see we'll produce this sort of simple visual to put in the grant or in the application. We can pause if anyone has questions to go and put in the chat about this example, and then Holly's going to talk about our second one.
I have a question. I see that you have a comparison with these 3 high schools. Do you do them with other high schools since the challenge is to show this show of need? Do you do it with other areas in Seattle?
So we did pause this year and look at a few other high schools that there's potential to work in and see where needs might have changed over the past 5 years, and then determine, which schools are we interested in. And we did decide that we wanted to continue working in Garfield and Rainier Beach. So that's why we focused on those 2.
Thank you.
Great. Let's go on to the next slide and look at the elephant in the room, gentrification. Now, Diana did a great job of showing how actually the diversity of Seattle has increased in the last 10 years. But Garfield High School in particular is in the Central District, which has seen a real big influx of a lot of often white, often childless people. So when we compare the school to the zip code, we see that the school has a much higher percentage of Black and African American students than the community as a whole. And the community as a whole has a lot higher rate of white, not Hispanic or Latino. So it helps in order to focus on the story of the students themselves that we disaggregate by race so that we can talk about what is happening with the parents and community of the Black or African American children, and not let ourselves get snowed in by the by that 25. What I don't know if you guys caught it, but the 25 to 35-year-old cohort in that zip code actually has like a 71% bachelor's rate. Sorry, 77%. That's incredible. They have a 77% of them have bachelors. So we are seeing a lot of younger don't have college age student people in the community, and we're trying to find tricky ways to disaggregate them away. Next slide, please. So again, we are using our lovely toolbar, ZICTA 598122. Now we're just going to say poverty by race. And we're going to have as a sort of our framing fact that 25% of Garfield students identify as Black or African American. So you see that they do this fun thing here where they actually just say 14.8% of the whole zip code is in poverty. But let's see what we can dig deeper. I'm going to click on that poverty status in the past 12 months, and next slide. Again, we get one of these clear as mud tables. You see that they break it out by age, sex, race. So another fun thing that I could do here is I could look at the poverty rate of that 5 to 17-year-old category as a way of pulling out what's happening with our students as opposed to the adults in the community. But for this example, I am going to focus a little bit on race. Next click, please. I just want to bring up that you want to make sure that your product says 2019 ACS 5-year estimate subject tables. They were supposed to update it to 2020 soon, but apparently data collection was so bad in 2020 that I don't know if they're going to release those results. So this may be what we have to work on for a little while. So then next click. Let's take a closer look at how the census talks about race. Diana touched on this briefly on her presentation and the importance of using white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, because although they're all listed on the same level like this, Hispanic or Latino origin of any race actually encompasses everybody above. So click again, please. Yes. So what you're going to want to do is ignore the white alone. That's actually not a very useful category for the most part. And whenever you want to talk about what you or I would on a day-to-day basis call white, just use the white alone, not Hispanic or Latino. And when you're using the data, you should be aware that the Black or African American alone and all the way down the list there does include people who identify also as Latino. So someone who maybe is of a Cuban who is both Black and Latino would be counted both in the Black and the Hispanic or Latino origin groups. So there is going to be some double counting, and depending on how precise you want to get, you may want to take that into account. But usually you're just looking at percentages, and I don't know, it can get a little tricky. So I just wanted to put that up as a big old caveat. All right, next slide. All right, so let's take a look. We zoom in here. We see that almost 30% of the Black or African American inhabitants of 98122 are below the poverty line. That is over twice as high as the zip code entirely. Now, as we pull it out, you'll notice that we also have very high percentages for our Native Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian / other Pacific Islander groups. But here's where I'd like to call your attention to those weird little plus minus numbers on the far right hand. They're called the margin of error. As I mentioned, the American Community Survey is based upon a sample, which means that they're not going around and asking every single Native American in the zip code about their income or anything else. So they're only able to get a few people every year because it's such a small population. And as a result, what the true percentage is for the population is very uncertain, because they don't know if they happen to just, of the 10 people who live there, if they just happen to catch the 2 people who were very poor or very rich. And so what you'll see is this very high margin of error. That means we think it's around 43.8%, but it could be anywhere from 13 to 73%. We're really not sure. you're saying that's a huge range. That doesn't help me at all, which is why I would say to use these numbers with the high margin of errors very, very cautiously in terms of planning. So that's why a lot of times if you want to talk about smaller demographic groups, you might have to go up to the city or higher level, because the bigger the sample, the more certain the estimate is going to be. Next slide. So for the very important question of how many people are living below the poverty line in Garfield zip code, we go through and we do it by race, and then we can replicate it for all of our upward bound schools and compare it with each school with Seattle-wide data. And next slide. I'm looking for any questions or thoughts. Oh, I see that Diana has dropped some knowledge about the ACS estimates for 2020. Do you want to tell us about that, Diana?
Yeah, I can just say very briefly that the 5-year estimates will still be coming out for the period ending in 2020. The data quality will be impacted a bit, but the Census Bureau figured it was still worth getting that out. However, the 1-year data are only going to be released down to the state level. Ooh. And even that is going to be an experimental data set, because the data collection during at least 6 months of the pandemic in 2020 was just severely impacted, and the quality of the data suck. Now they are they have applied some special weights and so forth to this experimental data set to make it a little bit more usable, but still it has to be used with extreme caution.
Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts that anyone has wants to drop into the chat? Great. Then I will hand it over to Henna from SPS.
Thank you, Holly. Hi, everybody. I am Henna Perveen, and I work in the Prevention Intervention Department at SPS. I'm battling a little bit of sun here. Okay. So I am gonna, next slide, please. I'm gonna talk about 2 behavioral health surveys that we administer at SPS. It's called the Healthy Youth Survey and the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And from those surveys, I'm gonna talk about some of the mental health data, some of the substance use data, and also give you a little peek into our internal discipline data from PowerSchool. Just look at the data, what our substance use policy is and procedure, and also just briefly talk about a few other data sources and in general how my department uses these data sources. Next slide, please. So first, like I said, the Healthy Youth Survey is one of the surveys that Seattle students receive. And this is a collaborative effort between OSPI, the Liquor and Cannabis Board, DSHS, and Washington DOH. So this survey happens every couple of years, but it was supposed to happen last year, but it did not because of COVID, since we're not in classrooms. So it's happening this year, and this year it's an online survey, opposed to in the past, it was always a paper survey. So something good came out of COVID. So it will be administered to 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, and the participation is voluntary and all the data is anonymous. Parents and students are notified about withdrawing from participation way in advance before the survey happens. And in general, the questions on the survey are on safety and violence, physical activity, diet, substance use such as alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, and also risk and protective factors. One click, please. And the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is very similar to the HYS. The difference is that, first of all, it is funded through the CDC, and also the students are not, middle school students are not surveyed. It's only a random sampling of students in 9th through 12th grade. And the reason we do both of these is because the Youth Risk Behavior Survey It depends on if we have funding for it from the CDC. So this year we do have a grant for it, which is a 5-year grant, but it might go away, and then we won't have the survey data anymore. But the HYS survey, which is a Washington survey, is we've been doing it for 10 to 12 years now, so it is it's more consistent. Next slide, please. And how we use these surveys is, first of all, it helps us understand the prevalence of health-related behaviors. Like I mentioned before, it has data. We get data on substance use. We get data on healthy eating, physical activity. So those that data is used by various departments to understand how individual schools are doing and what can be improved. And also it gives us data on things like bullying at school and if students feel safe at school. So that helps us understand the school climate. And an important thing is that comes out of this is it helps us justify new programs and projects for individual schools, and also evaluate the existing programs too and how we can improve it. And lastly, I think we all know this is these surveys are widely used in grant applications. Next, please. Thank you. So first, I'm going to cover some of the mental health data, and all the mental health data that I'm going to be sharing today is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey 2018. That is the latest survey we have. And like I mentioned before, we are doing both the surveys again. So next fall, we're going to have more updated data on these things. So first, for the mental health, we're going to look at percentage of high school students who felt sad or hopeless. You can just click next. Thank you. Perfect. So it shows the percentage of high school students who felt sad or hopeless almost every day for more than 2 weeks in a row, so that they stopped doing some usual activities. And this is like ever in the last 12 months. So as you can see, 28% of Seattle high schoolers said that they felt so, and the percentage was higher, way higher for female students than for male students, and also higher for Hispanic students, and the lowest reported was among white students. And for students, LGBT students, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual students, their percentage was more than double than their heterosexual counterparts, which is quite concerning. But this is a trend you will see in all the data that I'll share today. Next, please. Thank you. So for percentage of high school students who seriously considered suicide in the last 12 months before the survey, so overall 15% of high schoolers in Seattle said that they considered suicide. And again, percentage is higher for females, higher for Hispanic students, and again, higher for LGBT students. Next slide, please. And students who actually attempted suicide. Overall, 7% of students in Seattle attempted suicide. It was the same for male and female students. Way higher percentage for Hispanic identifying students, and the lowest among white students. And again, way higher for LGBT students than their heterosexual counterparts. Next, please. So this is the last data on youth mental health. So this question asked about having at least one teacher or adult in their school that they can talk to if they have a problem. So this is like the positive slide that 68% of students in Seattle said that they did have somebody that they could trust, that they could talk to. And it was pretty similar for male and female students. But when it came to the race breakdown, a little bit lower for Hispanic students and highest for white students, and percentages were the same for heterosexual and LGBT students. So that was all for the mental health data. Next, I actually have a question for you guys. If you are willing to just pop your answer in the chat, that'd be great. So what do you think is the most commonly used substance by teens these days? Pot. Okay, alcohol, nicotine, vape, chew, tobacco. vaping. Thank you. Thank you for participating. So I'm going to reveal the answer now. So alcohol is still the #1 drug of choice. I know vaping has received a lot of attention because we have seen a lot of increase in vaping because it's just a newer product that did not exist 10 years ago. But since its emergence in the US market, students have picked up vape pens, and the rates of student vaping has just skyrocketed than what it was 8 years ago. So yes, they do vape pot too. Yeah. So as you can see in this chart here, this is percentage of students who reported use in the past 30 days. For 12th grade, 37% of students said that they drank alcohol, and 1 in 4 10th graders said that they did so. And the percentages are still way lower in 8th grade, but something happens in that move from middle school to high school, where it goes from 8% in 8th grade to 25% in 10th grade, and continues to climb. And this is the trend that you will see for every substance. Same with marijuana. So what they say is alcohol is for the night and marijuana is for the day. So we do have a lot of marijuana offenses at school because students are vaping marijuana and smoking marijuana, dabbing marijuana at school. So, and then for vaping, these are mostly nicotine vaping, the data that I'm showing here, but they do vape pot as well. So it is 26% for 12th graders, 21% for 10th. And for prescription drugs, there's also some of that. 8% of 12th graders reported using prescription drugs that were not prescribed to them, or they used it not how they were supposed to be used. Next slide, please. So this is basically the same data, but just broken down by race. And this is just high school data for percentage of high school students who reported having drunk a glass, can, or bottle of alcohol in the past 30 days. This is for 10th and 12th grade combined. So district-wide, it was 31%, and the highest rates were reported among white students and the lowest among Black students, and everybody fell in between those two rates. Next, please. For marijuana use, 28% of Seattle students reported, high school students reported using marijuana. Highest rates again reported among white students at 34%, and Asian students reported the lowest use at 13%. Next, please. For vaping, 23% of students in Seattle reported vaping using an e-cigarette. And again, the highest rate was among white students and the lowest among Asian students. Next, please. And this is the last substance use slide that we have. So this is the percentage of students who reported prescription drug use not prescribed to them in the past 30 days. 7% of high school students said that they did so. And the lowest was actually among white students, and the highest was among Black students. So this slide is the anomaly here because we were following a trend that the highest substance use was noted among white students and lowest either among Asian or Black students. So for this one, it's still Asian students do report the lowest use, and so do white students, with the highest among Black students. And this is something to think about because when it comes to prescription drug use, this is the more hardcore stuff that can causes it can lead to more fatalities too than just drinking alcohol. I'm not saying that drinking alcohol is not a problem, but prescription drug can have more serious consequences. So yeah, this slide stands out to me for that reason. Next slide, please. And I want to talk a little bit about what our policy is at SPS. So as you can expect and hope, that we do not allow any possession, use, distribution, or selling of drugs or alcohol by anyone on school property, on school-sponsored transportation, or as part of the school activities. And any student who is found in violation of this policy might be subjected to disciplinary procedure. I am going to talk a little bit about what our disciplinary procedure used to be in the past, and we went through a major overhaul in 2017. I'm going to talk about what it looks like now and what were the reasons for that overhaul. Next, please. So in the past, the disciplinary procedure was very rigid, and it did not allow administrators to consider circumstances in the disciplinary process. And most of the time, the administrators are assistant principals at most of these schools. And because of this, administrators felt that they had very little control in the outcome of the disciplinary process. And the result of this was, one click, please. And one more. Thank you. And the result of this was that a lot of students were put through exclusionary disciplinary processes, resulting in negative outcomes for students and their families. And what I mean by this exclusionary discipline is they were suspended, like out of school suspension. So this could be a short-term suspension, a long-term suspension. And this resulted in loss of instructional time and also further increased the disproportionality in discipline that we have in Seattle. Next slide, please. Thank you. So like I said before, in 2017, we had a major overhaul of the disciplinary procedure. And now what happens is administrators have more control over the disciplinary process. They have the ability to make a disciplinary decision based on the student's grade level, the type of offense, and mitigating and aggravating factors. And a mitigating factor could be something like it was the student's first offense of that kind. And an aggravating factor might be that this was the student's fifth offense of that kind. And there are a lot of other mitigating. We actually have a huge list of mitigating and aggravating factors that are provided to administrators. And whatever decision they make, they need to be able to justify it. It's not like even though administrators have more control, they still check to make sure that the discipline that was implemented on the student is still justified. And so we do that at the district level. We monitor the discipline in the prevention intervention department and also the discipline department. And the result or the goal with this overhaul on the disciplinary procedure was 2 clicks, please. Perfect. Thank you. That the disciplinary procedure would be least disruptive to the student-school relationship and minimize loss of instructional time, and provide the students and families with the help and support that they need to create positive change. And lastly, the biggest hope is to reduce the disproportionality in discipline. And next slide, please. So like I said, I talked about a few reasons why we changed the procedure, but there are other reasons or rationale behind the disciplinary modification, and I'm just going to read these to you. So these are all research-based reasons that were used. So firstly, suspensions are ineffective in reducing future behavior issues and in fact increase the likelihood of future suspensions. Students of color and students with disabilities receive out-of-school suspensions at a far higher rate than their peers. Next, please. Students are 5 times more likely to drop out, 6 times more likely to repeat a grade, and 3 times more likely to have contact with the juvenile justice system if suspended just once. And out-of-school youth are significantly more likely than in-school youth to become involved in physical fights, carry a weapon, smoke, use alcohol, marijuana, or other drugs, and engage in risky sexual intercourse. Next slide, please. So this slide, I'm going to share some data from our internal data source, PowerSchool. This will show you a little bit of the disparity that we currently have this is just alcohol and other drug suspensions and just a short-term suspension among high school students. So as you can see here, overall, the average for all races in 2018-19 was 3.3 days, and average length of short-term suspensions, and that reduced to 2.5 days in 2019 and 2020, which is great news. And we will see that it reduced for all of the races. And I only have 3 races here because the data source that I was working with last year was very small, thanks to COVID. Usually we would look at the whole year, but to do an accurate comparison, I only could compare data from September through March for 2018-19 to 2019-2020 school years. So like I was saying before, that short-term suspension days or the length of short-term suspension went down for all races, but the disparity still exists. For example, for Caucasian students in 2019-20, 2.3 days was the average length of short-term suspensions, but for Hispanic students, it was 2.7, and for African American students, it was 2.8. So,
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay, we can go back. It's okay, you know what? It's totally fine because I was done with, oh, perfect.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries at all. Okay, so yeah, so the disparity still exists. It has existed for a long time, but we are really focusing on this now, and we have a discipline dashboard now that is internal for all the administrators that they don't rely on my analysis of this anymore. It's available to every school. They can look at the disproportionality at their school, not just by race, but a lot of different indicators, which is very useful, and it is available to them throughout the year. And that was all about disproportionality. We can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And a couple of smaller data sources that we use are, especially in the middle schools, called SBIRT, which stands for Screening, Brief Intervention, Referral to Services. So this is in a lot of our middle schools at this point. And again, this is funded through the Best Stars for Kids levy, and mostly gives us information from middle schools. And this includes same behavioral health kind of data. And it results in almost immediate action if a student says on the survey that they're suicidal. We have people at the school. There is a prevention specialist, there are counselors, nurses who intervene immediately. If there are other concerns like bullying, that is brought to these specialists that we have, and it is dealt with during that school year and as soon as possible. And the other data source that my department uses is also the climate survey, just to understand how safe schools are, how connected students are feeling at their schools. And these are used in communicating with school administrators about how we can improve this school climate. Last slide, please. Thank you. So I talked a lot about a lot of different sources of data and the data itself, but what do we really do with this data? So first of all, building a positive learning environment is very important. And this is something that we look at the district level, and also talk to schools directly about building positive learning environments, because young people are likely to spend more waking hours in the school environment around teachers than at home with their parents, making the school social environment a key factor in influencing the development of young people. And research has shown that positive relationship with school, which creates a greater sense of community, attachment, and performance, is associated with reduced potential for drug use. And apart from that, we also have more specific prevention intervention services. So at the tier 1, which is a universal service that is provided, not a service, a universal benefit that is provided to everybody is, first of all, we have health education in high school level, and also in 7th grade, we have a substance use curriculum called Project Alert. And I'm just talking about substance use, but there are so many other things. For example, there is Splash for sexual health that is also taught in every grade level. And we also have lessons on various substances that are provided to teachers when they're requested. In addition to that, for tier 2, we have groups such as Alateen and leadership clubs, life skills club that are available to students. And lastly, on tier 3, we have partnerships with behavioral health agencies, for mental health and substance use intervention services. And a lot of these agencies actually come to our schools now to provide these services so that there's no loss of instructional time, and that students are able to access these consistently without missing school or without having to worry about transportation. And in addition to these, we also have a mental health support through school-based health centers. And we also have, this falls more under tier 1. We also have in general social emotional learning lessons that are at every grade level. Yeah, so those are the prevention intervention services. The last slide is just resources that I hope will be available to you. But if I have some time, I can take some questions. If you guys have any questions, if you are willing to just write in the chat, that'd be great.
There are some comments and questions in the chat. From Karen Akada, the basic requirements for UB are similar across all programs in the US, but what we do, how we do it, and who we target within the population of low-income first-generation students can differ. I'd be happy to provide more detail. Feel free to contact me directly. Thank you. Regarding suspension, this is from Robin Amadam. Regarding suspension length of time, who within the school is determining the number of days? I was just wondering, it seems that shining a light on the disparity by race has made the positive difference in 2019-2020.
Yeah, so it is usually the school administrator, and in most schools, if a school has one, it's the assistant principal who's responsible for discipline. But we are able to see that data immediately, and if there seems to be an issue with the data, for example, if we think that, for example, if it is a use or possess issue, it should be a shorter length of suspension than for an offense like selling or distributing, because you are affecting more students. So it is a decision made by the school administrators, but the discipline department and my department oversees that to make sure that there's no discipline that is unjustified or unfair that is being implemented by schools.
Thank you. And I know and that a lot of this data is new, and we're some of the first people to see some of this data, so I appreciate this very much. Yeah. Thank you. And last but not least, let's talk and let's hear from our Demographer at Seattle Public Schools about Seattle trends and enrollments and other impacts. So welcome, Janine.
Hi, everyone. If you could go to there you go, perfect. So yeah, hello, my name is Janine Needles. I'm the demographer on the enrollment planning team with Seattle Public Schools. So very, very excited to be here today to kind of just sit and have an opportunity to talk about youth data with you all. So this presentation is mostly going to be focused on enrollment trends from the academic year last year, from 2020 to 21, which I know was a very odd year for a lot of us, and the school district included. So thought it would be a good opportunity to sit down with you all, talk about some of the findings and what that means for us and how we're planning for this upcoming year. So next slide, please. So here I just kind of wanted to start with a very high level look at historical enrollment. Here you can see a chart with our October 1st enrollment counts by year over the last 10 years. Just as kind of a side note, for those who don't know, October 1st is our official count date every single year. So that is what you're seeing here is what enrollment was across the district on October 1st. So as you can see, enrollment fell pretty significantly in 2020. I'm sure this is of no surprise to anyone. This decrease in enrollment occurred due to a number of different factors that we'll discuss in this presentation, but of course we cannot ignore the impacts of COVID-19 and remote learning. With 2020-21 being such an unprecedented school year, districts across the US have experienced similar decreases in their school enrollment as well. It's not just SPS, and I will go into that into some more detail later on, but This presentation will go into detail on a bunch of different topics related to what occurred in this drop, how it occurred differently across the district at different grade levels and in different student residences, and what that looks like. So yeah, next slide. Thank you. So this is just a chart that provides a different visual representation of what you had just seen in the previous chart. Instead of just seeing what looked to be, you know, not the most dramatic drop as it was going across the 10 years up into 2020, now you're just seeing the growth rate over the last 10 years. So as you can see, from 2010 all the way to 2017, there was some level of growth happening, varying of course, but some level of growth. 2018, there was a slight dip, and then back in 2019, we increased again. But as you can see, it's a pretty dramatic drop that we experienced in 2020, that actual number. And just as sort of a little bit of context, I also provided all the way to the far right our projected 2020 growth rate, which was smaller than usual given the circumstances, but still was not quite as dramatic of what actually ended up happening. Next slide, please. So I realize that there is a lot of information on this slide. I wanted to provide you with a table of all of the information broken down by grade level, since this is where you're going to see the most dramatic differences across the district. So going column by column, we have grade levels. Next, you have that October 2019 official count, which, as I mentioned, is the count of all enrolled students on our October 1st date. Next, you have the 2020 projection. Following that is the October 1st, 2020 official count by comparison. Then you will see a count difference which takes the 2020 October count and 2019 October count and subtracts the two. The projection difference, which does the same but for our 2020 projection and 2020 enrollment count. And then what I really wanted you to, have your attention drawn to is focusing in on this last column. This column titled Projection Percent Difference. So this shows that the official counts were significantly lower than projected for 2021 across the board for different grade levels. And that what is most important here is the drop was mostly concentrated at the kindergarten level. So take note of that negative 14.8% there. And you can see that across grades 1 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12, there are more minute changes in percentage. But this is going to be a really important piece moving forward. So we'll explore this a little bit more in depth on the next slide. So next slide, please. Okay, lots more data. So here you can see enrollment by grade band, and each grade band or, general grade bands have their own chart. So going across, we have kindergarten, elementary school, which is 1 through 5, middle school being 6 through 8, and then high school being 9 through 12. I do want to also highlight that preschool is not included here. So looking at the enrollment by grade band, when doing a grade level analysis, we can see, as I mentioned before, that the kindergarten enrollment dropped by far the largest percentage across all grade bands. Here, this is comparing actuals as opposed to comparing against the projected rate for 2020. And you can see for kindergarten, we had a 15.4% drop, which is pretty substantial. Elementary school enrollment, so as I mentioned, being grades 1 through 5, dropped by 4.4% from the previous year, from 2019, which is also fairly substantial, not quite as dramatic as kindergarten, but still pretty substantial. And then contrastingly, the middle school and high school enrollment counts actually saw slight increases in 2020 going up from 2019. So although this seems kind of odd when looking at all of the other data, I did want to mention that this was actually to be expected. We have a large cohort that's actually passing up through our higher grades due to a normal grade progression. So what was originally a bubble within our elementary cohort moved up into middle school and high school. And so that's why you're seeing that increase. And while there is an increase there in 2020, it's not quite as much of an increase as we would have expected on a normal year. So while there are a number of contributing factors here to enrollment decreases, and we do want to acknowledge that there are contributing factors outside of COVID-19 and all of the impacts of COVID-19, we do, want to highlight that remote learning and the start of remote learning in fall of 2020 likely impacted kindergarten through 5th grade enrollment substantially. especially when considering things like the difficulty of balancing remote learning with younger children. And it is also possible that some families with children that would have entered kindergarten otherwise in 2020 might have decided to wait to enroll their children and see what would happen next year. So next slide, please. Thank you. So here you can see another table with lots and lots of data, but what I wanted to show you was what this looks like across other districts outside of SPS. So this table shows enrollment counts for the 2020 to 21 school year across a number of different districts. I did just want to mention the districts in this table are those that we use within enrollment planning often to reference for benchmarking purposes. The reason we've selected these districts to include here is based on some of their similarities to Seattle Public Schools, whether it's by size, demographics, proximity, or any combination of those factors. So as you can see, looking across, we wanted to include a few years of data here. So there's 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020, and then of course what we're all interested in, 2020 to 21. And what you can see is that all districts in this table experienced similar drops in enrollment in the 2020 to 21 school year that Seattle Public Schools did. And there is some variation here, some of them experiencing a larger drop than others, but basically what we're getting across here is that this seems to be a trend that was not, only within Seattle. This was something that was experienced across the country. Next slide, please. So what does that mean specifically within Seattle Public Schools and within Seattle as a city? So I wanted to go into a little bit more of a geographic look at what this looked like. Just to point out, this analysis includes data for all K through 12 students. And what we're looking at here is on the left, you can see a map of our elementary and middle school attendance areas. And really, I just kind of wanted to have that as a general reference here. The way that I'm talking about this data on this slide is in terms of service areas. Just as kind of a little bit of a definition, service areas here are referring to our middle school attendance area boundaries. The reason that this was used for this level of analysis is it just provides a little bit of a larger level of analysis as opposed to looking at specific attendance areas, and makes it a little bit more comprehensible for this format. So for clarification, student residence refers only to residence of students that are enrolled at the school district. This does not include any data on student-aged population outside of students that are already enrolled. But what I wanted to point out here is that 10 out of 12 of our service areas saw decreases in their student residence in 2020 to 21. And you can see that by the overwhelming red bars to the right. The greatest decrease that we saw, as you can see at the bottom, occurred in the McClure service area by 7.1%. This service area characteristically consists of a higher portion of lower equity schools. And by lower equity schools, I mean schools that have fewer students of color furthest from educational justice. So that's noteworthy. And then by contrast, the only two service areas that saw an increase in student residence from 2020 to 21 were the Washington and Mercer International service areas. So by contrast, both of these areas are areas that consist of higher proportions of high equity schools, meaning that they have more students of color furthest from educational justice, which sticks out to us as something to keep track of. The other thing that is noteworthy here is that these two service areas, Washington and Mercer International, have been experiencing substantial growth for quite some time now. I'm sure, as some of you might be aware, following some of the goings of SPS, we recently had a boundary change go into effect for the Mercer International Middle School for this exact reason. So this growth here is not totally unexpected, but it is very noteworthy when looking at it contrastingly with the rest of the district. Next slide, please. So a little bit of shifting gears, I wanted to focus in on K through 5 since that's where we saw decreases in 2020, mostly the kindergarten grade band. So K through 5 out-migration from 2019 to 2020 far exceeded in-migration and at a much higher rate than previous years. So just to kind of go through what that means, I've included some definitions here for reference. Current students who were not enrolled in SPS in grades K through 4 in 2019 and who were newly enrolled in SPS for 2020 is considered in-migration, whereas the opposite, former students who were enrolled in SPS grades K through 4 in 2019 but did not return to SPS in 2020 is considered out-migration. And what you can see here in looking at the past 5 years, we do expect some level of out-migration for K through 5. What is particularly noteworthy here, though, is that we're going from 300, 326, 599, 238, some slight variations there, all the way up to 1,103. That's a pretty substantial difference. So that is something that we've definitely taken note as being different. So as talked about briefly in previous slides, COVID-19 and remote learning are considered to be significant contributing factors to these large decreases in K through 5 enrollment. You know, there are lots of reasons for why that could be. Families with children that the district expected to enter kindergarten in 2020 based on the birth rates that we keep track of and our birth decay rates that we use for projections. It just seems that these families did not enroll their kids in kindergarten. It is also important to keep in mind, you know, outside of the scope of schools, that the economic downturn due to COVID-19 could have caused some of these families to move outside of the district as well. Next slide, please. So I really wanted to make sure to include this slide to provide some context for the data shown in this presentation. I think this is one of the more interesting findings here. So as you can see in that top table, that to the left is our enrollment count in July 2020 prior to announcing the start of remote learning for fall 2020. And then to the right, you see our October 1st enrollment count. So what this is showing here, and you can see in the table below that going by school year, from July to October, similar as with the out-migration, we expect some level of negative change. As you can see for 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020, there were negative numbers of students leaving from July to October, and that's to be expected. That's pretty normal. But similarly as with the out-migration, for 2020 to 21, 1,180 students is what we lost between before the announcement and the October 1st date, which is a pretty substantial amount. In fact, it's a substantial proportion of all of the students that we had lost from the previous year. So I did kind of want to mention here, this is a very important thing to keep in mind when looking at this data, how much that announcement of remote learning impacted our enrollment. But I did also want to mention that we have been doing other levels of analysis looking into seeing, if these students didn't move outside of the district, where did they go, So we did do an analysis looking into private school enrollment, charter school enrollment, virtual school enrollment, the latter of which was at the state level. And what we did end up finding being the most noteworthy of those findings was perhaps pretty intuitive, not too surprising, but online school trends for state-approved virtual schools showed substantial increases in enrollment for 2020. And we saw very much of the same thing for homeschooling as well. Not so much for private schools and charter schools, which was interesting because I think a lot of people expected that to be the case. But when you think about it intuitively, if students are going to be doing remote learning anyhow, it does make sense that some families decided, well, I can choose an online program elsewhere as well. So that data was data that was provided to us by OSPI, which Holly had mentioned OSPI. And if anybody was interested in seeing what that data looks like, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to share. Next slide, please. So kind of within the same tangent of looking at these transfers in, transfers out, I did also want to point out something else that was pretty significantly different from 2020. So we normally see a number of students transfer into the district in the time between September and October, as you can see here for 2018 to 19 and 2019 to 2020. However, 2020 to 21 was different, and it was the first time in the last few years that we actually dropped between those two dates. And all of the other slides kind of provide evidence for why that might be, but it still, regardless, is different and noteworthy. Next slide, please. So in summary of some of these changes, and I know I have a lot of text on this slide, but I wanted to make sure that you kind of had this bulleted to, have a general sense of what all did happen. So in 2020, enrollment in the district across the board, not by grade level, not by any, different categories, just across the board was 2.3%, which was pretty in line with what we saw in other districts as well. A large portion of students dropped after the announcement of the remote learning plan, which is notable. K through 5 outmigration from 2019 to 2020 far exceeded in-migration and at a much higher rate than previous years. Just in line with that, September to October enrollment numbers decreased for the first time in the last few years as well. Most importantly are these last two bullet points. Enrollment decreases have been limited to K through 5, with kindergarten experiencing the largest percent drop in enrollment from last year. And 10 out of 12 of the service areas, based on our middle school boundaries, saw decreases in their student residents in 2020, with the greatest decrease occurring in McClure. Next slide, please. So after this spiel about what all did happen in 2020 to 21 with our school data, I'm sure everyone is very curious to know what all is going on now that school has started this month and what's happening with our 2021 counts. I can tell you that preliminary numbers show that district enrollment is still lower than expected for 2021 to 22, the academic year. And this is despite a return to in-person learning for most students and despite an expected boom in the kindergarten level for 2021. And when I say that boom that we expected, this was due to a peak in birth rates that happened in 2016. So based on our birth to K ratios that we use for projections, we had anticipated for a while that 2021 would have this huge increase in kindergarten enrollment. And what the preliminary numbers are showing is that's just not the case, or at least it isn't yet. So while I wish I had concrete numbers to share with you right at this moment, the enrollment planning department will have those updated numbers for the 2021 to 22 school year at the end of October. And all of those updates, if you're curious and keeping in touch with that, will be posted on the public website, along with further analyses about the impacts of declining enrollment. And then, yeah, last slide. So I wanted to open up for any questions. I know what I gave you was kind of a bit of a spiel about last year, not this year. And, I'm curious to hear if there are questions about some of that. I did include here a link to the research and partnership page, which is where our enrollment planning research and data lives. So if you're curious and looking at a little bit more specific data about certain schools, you can look there. We also have a school description dashboard there, which gives you a look specifically at each school and demographic makeups and different measures like that at the school level. So yeah, with that being said, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Although I know policy-related questions and concerns are important when talking about enrollment trends, I would like to ask if we could stay within the scope as it relates to data. If you do have policy questions, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Thank you, Janine, for this presentation. One of the things that the reason why we did this series is to make sure the data is not something removed from our day-to-day, but it reflects and legitimizes our experience and what we're seeing in real life, right? Like what communities are experiencing. And for a lot of folks who are making decisions and applying for grants, and as we've seen in the whole presentation, all this information should be able to help us legitimize that experience. Like, yes, people, what's happening? So my question, I think it's like, what happened to all of those folks? And so from previous sessions, and is it because people moved from the city and then they're in South and King County areas? Is that pretty much where we think it's happening?
I would say that there's a lot of speculation about that still. I think that, we are taking note of the fact that online schools at the state level and homeschooling have increased a substantial amount, I do think a good portion of students have gone to those different alternatives. We have not seen huge increases at the private school level, so we don't necessarily think that that could be making up for all of those students lost. And then as for students moving outside of the district, what was particularly interesting for my team was seeing some of the census findings and looking at, student aged population, so 18 and under, and what those proportions have looked like and how have they changed over the last 10 years. And, seeing that those population, our population as a whole, 18 and over and under 18 has gone up in the last 10 years, of course, but that the proportion of the population made up by under 18, student age people is around the same as it was in 2010. The proportion itself hasn't changed much. I think it dropped by a single percentage point. So, I don't know that we're comfortable saying that we think all of those families just left Seattle, because it seems like the proportion has remained pretty stable. I think now it's a matter of, understanding a little bit better what alternatives have been the alternatives people have been seeking out. And so far, it seems like it's been online school and homeschooling options. And we're actually working a little bit with OSPI right now on a data request to see a little bit more detailed information about SPS specifically, where have students transferred out to.
Thank you. And I see there was a question about making the slides available. Yes, we will be sending a copy of the recording as well as the slides and some handouts. I know it's a lot to take, especially when, in 15 minutes, our presenters each gave us an incredible amount of information. And I am so thankful to have you all here. We went from learning how much Seattle has grown and the kids, where their ages and where they are in Seattle, to how to overcome challenges to prove that Seattle is not just the richest, one of the richest cities in the country, to understanding dynamics within mental and health behavior. And we end up with where are and how are kids enrolling in the Seattle Public Schools. So that was a lot of information, and we are so hoping that this was as helpful as it was for me. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, the speakers. Thank you for taking your lunch time to be with us. And just a heads up that we are going to be having our next session next month. And this is going to be, these are links of resources that we're going to be sending to you. We'll add some more with more information. This is the contact information for all of our speakers for today. And we want to hear from you and let us know how it was. I wanted to tell you, next session, it's going to be on October 26th, I believe, and it's going to be about redistricting. So what is redistricting? What happens and with city councils now that there's more people in Seattle? Do they get the same? Do they move? Who changes them? Who's in charge of that? So stay tuned for our next session. And thank you again, everybody. And if you have questions, please let us know. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Holly and Isabel and Shushan and all of us. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you.